Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And once again joined by Ritchie, Robertson, and this week we're going to talk about part two of the Enlightenment. And Ritchie has, of course, written The Enlightenment, The Pursuit of Happiness, which I'm holding up right here, if you can see it here. And this part is named, last part was named The Pursuit of Happiness. And this week we're going to talk about the age, the famous epitaph for the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. And last week, before from last week, going onwards from last week, I want to begin with the abolishment of torture. We ended up with the Women and the Scientific Revolution last week, I believe, and I want to begin this week with the abolishment of torture because torture has been up until this point a very common use and practice among the countries that have talked about, and even up until Maria Theresia as well, the Habsburg lands were one of the later countries to abolish torture, and I believe Chancellor Kronitz as well was really one person who were embarrassed of being also because torture was still being used. But let's begin with the practice of torture in the under the Enlightenment, and how the enlightened thinkers and Enlightenment had an effect on the abolishment of torture.
Well, I have to differentiate here. Torture was a standard practice in Roman law and in the modern countries which had systems of Roman law. So it wasn't in use in England or Britain, but in France, Germany, and Austria. Capital crimes that carried the death sentence as a penalty did involve torturing the suspect in order to extract a confession. Now, Enlighteners realized that this was a very inhumane practice and also not very effective, because people would say anything under torture to make the pain stop. Also, some criminals were hardened and could endure torture. Other people, especially those likely to be wrongly accused, were more delicate and would succumb. So the practice was not only inhumane, but impractical. Over the 18th century, torture was reduced or abolished in a number of countries. You mentioned Austria. The Chancellor Kaunitz, under Maria Theresia, disapproved of it. The Austrian Enlightenment thinker, Joseph von Sonnenfels, was a strong opponent of judicial torture. In fact, a story has him going down on his knees before Maria Theresia and pleading with her to abolish torture. But in fact, by that time, the 1770s, torture was already going out of use, and it was abolished in one country after another. In Prussia, for example, if I remember correctly, in the 1790s. But it's worth remembering that some famous enlightened thinkers who were lawyers by profession, I'm thinking especially of Montesquieu, would actually have practiced torture on suspects or stood by and watched it being done. So it was something very real. And an extension of torture, you could say, was the death penalty. But this is something which Enlighteners were much more divided. There was a strong humane argument for abolishing the death penalty, and also practical argument. After all, if you execute the wrong person, you can't make it right afterwards. So, for example, one of the most influential books of the time was the little treatise by the Italian jurist Cesare Beccaria on crimes and punishments. Beccaria advocated abolishing the death penalty, but instead making sure that crimes would always be followed by punishment. He pointed out with the haphazard police methods used in the 18th century, most crimes were not detected, most criminals were not caught, and therefore could carry on with impunity. But there's a downside to this. As the obvious alternative to the death penalty was hard labor, forced labor. And it's thought too that if criminals performed their forced labor in public, that would be a very effective deterrent because it would put them to shame. So criminals in chain gangs would sweep the streets of Austrian cities. And they would haul barges on canals. But this itself was inhumane. Under the Enlightened Emperor Joseph II, who came to the throne as sole ruler on the death of his mother, Maria Theresia, in 1780, convicts had to haul barges along the Danube, sleeping at night in caves. The banks were muddy. The death rate among convicts hauling barges was very high, something like 2/3. So that wasn't really a humane alternative. At the same time, a number of enlightened thinkers maintained that the death penalty was justified because if the punishment should be in some way equal to the crime, then murder required the death penalty. An innate sense of justice required the death penalty. And also, it means treating the criminal as a responsible person who understands the seriousness of what he's doing and pays the due penalty. Adam Smith, for example, and Kant were strong advocates of the death penalty for this reason. So as with most issues in the Enlightenment, Enlighteners were not unanimous. The Enlightenment here as elsewhere was an argument, a conversation with some with two or more different views. And we haven't, of course, even entered into the question of prisons and prison reform. I don't know whether you want to go there.
And I wanted to bring up as well when it comes to the instrument of torture, as you well know, that it's not like you said, not a very effective method for interrogation, because if you, like I said, if you are innocent and you are tortured, you may be tortured into doing a confession, even if you didn't do the crime, you still under constant pressure, and I can't imagine being tortured. I'd probably give in myself if you tortured long enough. So you would give in even if you are innocent, and you still be found guilty of the crime you did not commit if you had been tortured long enough.
Well, that is an obvious point to make. That torture, besides being cruel, is ineffectual, and the Enlighteners made that point as forcibly as they could.
And I also want to, you mentioned Joseph II, and I want to talk about especially Joseph II and Frederick the Great as the famous enlightened monarchs. Though I'm not personally sure that Frederick deserves the epitaph the Great. Personally, I think he should better be called the Lucky. That's another podcast. But let's talk about the famous monarchs and the enlightened monarchs of today. And so let's talk of the impact and how did they become these famous enlightened monarchs?
Well, you can easily draw a contrast with some well-known monarchs of the previous century. Louis XIV, for example, aimed at grandeur, at the aggrandizement of France, and of course of himself. In England, Charles II was an entirely irresponsible monarch who didn't pay much attention to the business of government. In the 18th century, a number of monarchs appeared with a much stronger sense of responsibility. You mentioned Frederick the Great in Prussia, Joseph II in Austria, and I'd also mention Katherine the Great in Russia, who did her best to introduce Enlightenment into her domains.
I do believe you wrote about how she wasn't princess, and that this was more for her. People viewing Katherine as for her own, how she would be viewed in Europe, and maybe not entirely. It was more some critics of her claim that it was more selfish purposes that she was an enlightened monarch.
Well, that criticism has been made of her and of Frederick. I wouldn't go along with it myself. But a point I want to make is that enlightened philosophers expected political reform to come from the top down, not from the bottom up. And they therefore supported the endeavors of Catherine, Frederick, and Joseph to introduce, for example, enlightened legislation into their domains. Voltaire corresponded with Frederick, helped him to write his famous treatise against Machiavellianism, the Anti-Machiavel, spent some time at his court in Berlin, but fell out with him very badly. Diderot went to Russia, invited by Catherine the Great, spent some time there. She was certainly very kind to him, and bought his library to save him from having to sell it because he was hard up. They had many conversations. How much attention she paid to him is a moot point. And Voltaire also corresponded with Catherine, but he came to be disillusioned. He felt that these enlightened monarchs were too much concerned with self-aggrandizement through war with other powers, and that he was being used as a tool, a cat's paw, to make them look respectable in the eyes of the world. Now, that may have been Voltaire's peak speaking. He may have felt they didn't pay him as much attention as they ought to, but it does speak to the disillusionment that some enlighteners felt with these so-called enlightened monarchs. What does the Enlightenment consist of? Well, first of all, progressive legislation, like the legal code put forward by Catherine the Great, but only partially adopted. Second, religious toleration. Fred the Great declared that every branch of Christianity was tolerated in Prussia, including Catholicism. Catholicism was a great stumbling block for enlighteners because it implied accepting that the authority of the Pope was superior to that of secular monarchs. But Frederick was not deterred by that, and in fact, he established the Catholic Cathedral, St. Hedwig's Cathedral, which exists in Berlin to this day. More controversial was giving religious liberty to small sects, like Quakers, members of the Moravian Brethren, etc. Frederick, however, did this. But he did so from a perspective of complete skepticism. In his history of his own time, he writes that all these sects have liberty of worship in Prussia, although one is more ridiculous than the other. There was also rational self-interest involved. When Huguenots were expelled from France, finally by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, they naturally dispersed as well as they could to neighboring countries, some to Britain, many to the Netherlands, and some to Prussia, where they're welcomed because they're educated and practical people who helped to build up industry. Or there's the case of the Salzburg Protestants. In 1732, Salzburg, which was not part of the Austrian Empire, but an independent prince-bishopric, expelled all its Protestant subjects. They trekked across Germany, drawing attention to the intolerance of the authorities in Salzburg, and found a way to Prussia, where they were welcomed. So you can see in the policies of these enlightened monarchs a combination of principle and self-interest. But they were sometimes too rigid. Joseph II in Austria tolerated only 3 religions. Catholicism, very much the dominant religion, Lutheranism, and Calvinism.
His mother, of course, Maria Theresa, was notoriously anti-Semite at the time, with the expulsion of the Jews in Galicia, I believe, under her reign. So was there some anti-Semitism in Joseph as well? Did he inherit some of Maria Theresa's bigotry during his time?
I think Maria Theresa was not so much anti-Semitic as a devout Catholic who thought toleration of all religions other than Catholicism was wrong. And Joseph actually was decidedly philo-Semitic. The patents of toleration, which he passed into law at the beginning of the 1780s, including a decree permitting Jews to worship and to adopt a wide range of professions. So that to that extent, he was an emancipator of the Jews. But he was also very tidy-minded. And Christians who didn't fit into his three categories were expected to convert or emigrate. For example, in Transylvania, he found a sect of Christians called Moravian Christians, a sect of their own, and they were sent into exile. So again, there were limits to Joseph II's tolerance. The other thing I should say about these enlightened monarchs is that they did wage war, and Frederick the Great earned a lot of odium because when he first came to the throne in 1740, he broke an agreement called the Pragmatic Sanction, by which the throne of the Austrian Empire was supposed to pass to the next heir, although she was a woman. Taking advantage of young Maria Theresa's supposed weakness, Frederick invaded and seized the Austrian province of Silesia. Now you can justify this in strictly political terms. Prussia was in danger of being encircled by more powerful countries, and Silesia was a buffer against invasion by Austria. But people felt that it was a very bad match for Frederick's proclaimed principles. And again, in 1756, he was again afraid of being encircled by other powers, and he attacked Saxony and thereby unleashed the 7 Years' War, which, because of various alliances that drew the European powers into conflict, became an international war.
In many people, and I call it World War Zero, but many people consider the 7 Years' War to be World War One. Many historians of the time, I think, because it was fought on several continents as well. Many consider this to be the real World War One, or as I call it, World War Zero.
Yes, well, that's quite true. And Macaulay, writing in the 19th century, said of it, to feed the ambition of a king, um, um, red men scalped each other in Canada, and black men fought each other on the coast of Coromandel. It also provided the British with the opportunity to wage war against France in order to seize French possessions in India. And Clive of India more or less drove the French out of India, leaving only a few small French enclaves, and founded the large group of territories which were administered by the British East India Company. That's not a very glorious story. In fact, a shameful one.
Nothing with the East India Company can be glorious, if you might add to that.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, if we talk about colonialism later, the activities of the East India Company will have to receive a very black mark. So yes, there's a case of calling the 7 Years' War, as you say, World War Zero.
And thing I want to talk about as well before we move on to the next. We are going to talk about colonialism by the end of the episode when we get back to that. And I want to talk about one thing as well, because as you know, Joseph II, he did abolish serfdom as well under his reign, and though that has kind of gotten some criticism because not all it had consequences of I don't remember where I read it or exactly the details of this, but it had got some criticism. But was the abolishment of serfdom in Habsburg lands, was that a result of the Enlightenment?
Serfdom was certainly widespread in Europe. There were about 1 million serfs even in 18th century France. It was common in Denmark, in northern Germany, in Austria, and in a sense, it's some abolition, although it lingered into the early 19th century, was a consequence of the Enlightenment. In my book, I lay great stress on practical enlightenment. Reform was brought about in order to not only to promote the happiness of a monarch's subjects, but also to increase the power of a state. Now, enlightened monarchs saw that the power of a state lay in the good management of its human resources. And serfdom was a very impractical way of using the available labor. It was much better to have an agrarian population which was well enough off and independent enough to pay taxes. Because don't forget that 18th century states not only relied on taxation to raise money, but they very often raised taxes from the parts of the population least able to pay taxes. In France, for example,
as it is today, for example.
Well, no, not in such a gross way today. In 18th century France, the nobles and the clergy were exempt from taxation, and the ordinary farmers had to stump up. Not only that, but again in France especially, you had the institution of tax farming. A wealthy person would be given the right to collect taxes from an area of the country, and that meant that he made people pay taxes and added something extra for himself. So that was a form of exploitation which was rightly seen as very distasteful. Again, in India, the British East India Company took over from the Mughal Empire the responsibility for raising taxes. And once again, they did so by means of tax farming in a very oppressive way that inflicted great damage on the Indian provinces that they controlled. So serfdom was certainly bad and faded out, but tax farming was a very great abuse, which needed to be abolished, and was, I think, largely swept away by the French Revolution.
Now, I know you mentioned Russia as sort of being a part of the Enlightenment, but there seem to be, especially historians of Russia as well, right? How the Enlightenment never really reached Russia fully, and there were consequences. For example, that there were still beheadings in Russia under Tsar Paul the First, and later on, but as well, that as for example in Turkey, I believe the Enlightenment never reached either. We don't want to talk about Turkey more in later on, but I wanted to talk a little bit about how those countries where the Enlightenment never fully reached outside of Europe, and what was the consequences where of the countries that never fully reached the Enlightenment.
The problem in Russia, I think, was that the educated class was comparatively small, and there's no question of them doing much to alleviate the lot of the serfs. Serfdom in Russia was only abolished in 1861, a very great and sweeping reform, but no thanks to the Enlightenment. I think, therefore, that enlightened thinking reached a smallish number of administrators and intelligentsia at the top of society. Didn't permeate further.
If I may, we know that Katherine the Great corresponded with Voltaire, and I do believe he wanted to come, but she was kind of embarrassed of a little bit of Russia, what he would think of her and Russia if he came. So never, though in the series The Great, he used in Russia, but in real life, he never really came to Russia. Though again, she is one of those monarchs of the time that did correspond frequently with Voltaire.
Yes, yeah. I think the spread of enlightenment required a public sphere, what we nowadays call the media, newspapers and periodicals, in which enlightened values are put forward. Think of the Spectator, written by Addison and Steele in the early 18th century in Britain. And I don't think Russia had enough of a public sphere for enlightenment to spread. There's a question among historians whether you will speak of an enlightenment in non-European countries. I don't know enough about the matter to comment usefully, but I can draw attention to a book by Christopher de Bellaigue, The Islamic Enlightenment, which argues that in the Islamic world, enlightened thinking was taking root in the late 19th century, not as an import from Europe, but as a natural development within Islamic culture, and taking the form, for example, of looking critically at the sources of sacred texts and allowing different possibilities of their interpretation. But if there was a nascent enlightenment in the Islamic world, it was snuffed out by the consequences of the First World War. The Ottoman Empire, the Islamic country most open to European influences, was on the losing side in the war. And
There was still a force to reckon with at the time, of course, and it wouldn't be until the 19th century that they were started low and slow decline. So it's still under the Enlightenment state, they were a force to be reckoned with.
Yes, but I'm talking about the beginnings of an Enlightenment in Turkey circa 1900. But the division of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, when parts were hived off, as Syria, Lebanon, etc., made people produced a very strong reaction among the religious. On the other hand, you see Kemal Ataturk as a modern enlightened monarch, bringing in reforms from above. But like the enlightened monarchs of the 18th century, had to contend with established counter forces, and that meant especially the churches. Joseph II's reforms produced so much alarm in Rome that in 782 the Pope actually paid a visit to Vienna in order to remonstrate with him. It was the first time that a Pope had travelled north of the Alps since the Council of Constance in 1515. But the standoff between Joseph and the Pope had no effect on Joseph, who stood his ground. In Russia too, the Tsars, not only Katherine but also earlier Peter the Great, had to find some way of taming the power of the church. Now, people who profess global history have looked for versions of the Enlightenment or analogies to it in the history of China, India, and Japan, but my knowledge comes to an end there.
If I may, I'm going to go a little bit far. This might be a bit controversial, I don't know, but I'm going to go just far as the Islamic world did have the Enlightenment much earlier than Europe under the Abbasid Caliphate, when they had a scientific not revolution, but they had the scientific highlight of the with the House of Wisdom, and in Cordoba, where they sampled several of the Greek works and the Greek writers as Aristotle and all the famous Plato, and this translated into Arabic work. I would say that under the Abbasid Caliphate, and they kind of did have the Enlightenment way earlier than Europe, and that's that kind of view kind of an Enlightenment with everything that they had, and this helped save so much of the ancient works and writers in the Abbasid and Cordoba. So I would say that in a way they already had an Enlightenment.
Well, whether Enlightenment is the right word for it or not, medieval Islam certainly pursued science and learning in a way with no parallel whatsoever in medieval Christendom. So I'll certainly give you that. But we're getting away from the 18th century.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that in my view, they kind of did have an Enlightenment before Europe had.
Yeah.
But the next thing I want to talk about, and this one is a little bit ironic, I think, because Rousseau was one that wrote extensively about family life, and as he mentioned in the book, he may not be the best example to lead for a family life, as he gave away his son to an orphanage at the time, which was not maybe as. And I believe a lot of modern orphanages are not quite do that either, but they certainly were better than 18th century France. But let's talk about Rousseau and his view on family, because let's talk about why maybe not be not to mention the best example as well.
Okay, well, Rousseau's private life is certainly an embarrassment. He had 5 illegitimate children by his mistress Thérèse de Levasseur, and he put them, as you say, into the Paris Foundling Hospital against their mother's wishes, and the death rate for children in the Foundling Hospital was at least 70%. So that's very much to his credit. And it's a curious paradox that Rousseau treated his own family so badly, so unfeelingly, and yet he wrote an immensely influential treatise on education, Emile, in the form of a novel, in which he describes the, as it were, ideal upbringing of a boy at the hands of a tutor. It's a rather curious fiction, because you don't learn anything about Emile's parents or how they came to hand him over to a tutor. And Emile apparently has no contact with other children. He misses out on a very important part of socialization. But be that as it may, Rousseau puts forward his principles that a child should be in contact with things, not words. Don't teach him abstractions, which mean nothing to a child, but show him real phenomena. Take him into the country and show him the things growing. You teach him about about the compass. Take him into a wood and make him get him lost and make him find his bearings by the sun. The young Emile is not encouraged to read any books, with only one exception, and that's Robinson Crusoe, because Robinson Crusoe is a very practical book, in which Crusoe learns practically every skill and trade in order to make a tolerable life for himself on the island. Practical learning, not mere book learning, is what Rousseau demands. That's for Emile. But Emile is supposed to have a sister called Sophie, and Sophie is to be brought up quite differently, and have a very much more restricted education. So Rousseau's Enlightenment doesn't extend to any kind of emancipation for the female sex. Anyway, Emile had a great many admirers. Some people tried to bring up their children with the freedom given to Emile. For example, one admirer, Richard Edgeworth, the mother of the novelist Maria Edgeworth, brought up his son that way, didn't teach the boy anything until he seemed to be ready for it. And the result was that the boy got on quite well, but he was extremely headstrong and difficult to deal with. So I think to be practical, Rousseau's principles would have to be modified a good deal in teaching an actual child.
Were some of these books put in practice by anyone or did anyone actually try to live up to the ideal of Emile and Susie in a way, or try to work this out in the family life?
Well, I mentioned the example of Richard Edgeworth, or a more modified Rousseauism to be found in a very attractive book of the 1770s by Madame d'Épinay, an educated Frenchwoman, called Conversations avec Émilie, Conversations with Emily. And in a series of dialogues between mother and daughter, ending when Emily reaches the age of 10, Madame d'Épinay shows how you encourage children to learn about the world around them, not through abstractions, but through concrete experience. Um, um, Telling them the knowledge, for example, that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit is absolutely useless. It means nothing to a child. But boiling and freezing water as a sort of instructive game does teach them much more of the natural world. Or again, history is largely useless for a child because kings, empires, laws, battles, etc., are too remote from his experience. So that's not useful study for very young people. They should be taught about things they can see and touch. And again, they ought to learn empathy. For example, Emily is told she mustn't pull the wings off flies because it causes the flies pain. And I ought to insert at this point, since you used the phrase the age of reason at the outset, the Enlightenment is just as much the age of feeling, of sensibility, of sentiment. Reason and sensibility go hand in hand.
So then the next thing, of course, that but this was one of my favorite parts of the book is that history would also get a makeover in a time of the Enlightenment. And I want to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk about Gibbon, of course, in a second. But I want to talk about how the view on history and how writing history changed profoundly during the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment.
Okay. The Enlightenment innovation was what was called philosophical history. That is, history was no longer just a chronicle of events. The attempt was made to find an underlying pattern. And I think I want to point to two models used by many, not all, Enlightenment historians. One is what is called the four stages theory. That is, a study of the ascent of civilization from the first stage of hunting and gathering, then via herding, that is, keeping flocks as practiced by, for example, the nations in Central Asia that repeatedly attacked the Roman Empire. Then from herding, which is still a nomadic way of life, you come to agriculture, which means a settled existence. And in order to get to the present, historians look at the feudal age in medieval Europe, and the end point they arrive at is modern commercial society. Now, not all historians follow this pattern. Gibbon doesn't, for example, but my namesake, William Robertson, applies it in his histories, including
no
his
family
history,
relations, I'm sure.
No relation, including his history of America, where he uses this pattern to locate the civilizations of the Aztecs and Incas, who seem, he says, to have come straight from the hunter-gatherer stage to agriculture. They had no herdsmen in America because they had no domestic animals suitable for breeding, except that the Incas made some use of the llama. But otherwise, the American pattern diverged from the European one. So the four stages theory is not a one-size-fits-all model you can apply to every civilization. It brings out interesting similarities and differences. The other model used by philosophical historians, and here we can bring in Gibbon, is the model of growth and decline. Looking back at ancient history, historians will see how Rome grew into a republic that conquered its neighbors, from that into an empire, how along the way it went through a period of chaos and civil war in the 1st century BCE, and that required a strong man to impose order. The strong men being, first of all, Julius Caesar, and second, his nephew, Octavius, who we know as the Emperor Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Gibbon then chronicles the decline of the Roman Empire and what he calls the triumph of barbarism and religion. In the chapter on Gibbon in my book, I argue that the decline and fall is not a celebration of progress, but rather a melancholy warning that all civilizations must decay. And it's not for nothing that the history ends by surveying the ruins of Rome at the present day. It would be quite wrong to imagine that Enlightenment historians were naive spokesmen for progress. They knew that all civilizations have their day. Hume, for example, who wrote a very important history of England, also has an essay whether Britain inclines more towards a republic or to an empire, and that he sees the various possibilities in the future, but he thinks it most likely that commercial society will accrete more and more power, and eventually fall into civil war, which will end with dictatorship. And that he then says that we might as well have an absolute monarchy now and save ourselves the trouble of going through these civil wars. You can see that Hume is not any kind of naive optimist about the future. You do find some Enlightenment writers who take a much more starry-eyed view of history. Turgot, for example, in the speech about progress he gave to the Sorbonne in 1750, my favorite example is Louis Sebastien Mercier and his what we would now call a science fiction book, The Year 2400.
Which we mentioned last time, by the way.
Well, I'm very fond of it. And the thing is, though, to a naive reader, it seems like a forecast of uninterrupted progress. But I think it reads much more like a satire on the inflated expectations of some enlighteners.
So, and you mentioned Gibbon, and what you dedicate even a chapter as well solely to Gibbon. So let's talk a little bit more about how Gibbon, with the kind of fall, changed history writing as well, because it's a beautiful piece of work. And let's talk about how Gibbon helped change history as well.
That's not so easy because the Decline and Fall is such a monumental work. It's not easy to imitate. I think one important thing is that Gibbon immersed himself in the primary sources, in the historians of the late Roman world. And he actually had all the works he used in his own personal library. That would be impossible nowadays, but he didn't have to use a public library, therefore. He had everything on his shelves. Not only the ancient historians, but the modern commentators, the modern church historians, who refers to in great detail. So attention to primary sources is something very important. Then also, Gibbon is the supreme example of history as literature, history as well written. And again, it was important not only to him but to other enlighteners that history was a branch of literature. That didn't mean that it was fiction, but did mean that it should be enjoyed by other than professional historians. And after all, there were very few professional historians. If anything, I think Gibbons' legacy was overturned in the 19th century by the growth of professionalism among historians. Another thing to remember is that Gibbon didn't have much access to archaeological information. Pompeii and Herculaneum were beginning to be excavated in his day, but I don't think he knew much about them. So the material civilization of ancient Rome and its successors doesn't bulk very large in his book. I would say there's that Gibbon, only to a very limited extent, set a standard for subsequent historians.
It's interesting to me how Gibbons' The Final Fall is kind of disputed as not very reliable work today among ancient historians and classicists. But still, Gibbon has been constantly referred to, even in works not about ancient Rome, such as yours, of course, it is very easy. But still, if you read an word, for example, on maybe Russia, you could even still refer to Gibbon in the book, for example. That's just an silly example, but still, even in books about more modern history, you will still find references to Gibbon. For example, I read about the Danish Empire many years ago, where they mentioned, but Gibbon is mentioned as well. So his influence is arguably perhaps one of the biggest legacies of the Enlightenment, and he is arguably one of the most influential. Like I said, even though his work has been disputed, he's still one of the most influential historians in the world of the more early modern era.
Well, an ancient historian has to read Gibbon, has to have read Gibbon, although the practice of history now is very different. One aspect of Gibbon that we ought not forget, perhaps, is his skeptical, perhaps even polemical account of Christianity in the Roman Empire. His famous 15th and 16th chapters deal with the growth of Christianity, and they dispute or represented as myths a great many widely held beliefs on the history of Christianity. For example, Gibbon thinks, and I think modern historians support him in this, the number of martyrs was very much exaggerated. He also points out that some martyrs actually called for their martyrdom. They sought martyrdom as a way of bearing witness to their faith. And the authorities, except at certain limited periods, were actually very reluctant to persecute them. We have, for example, some correspondence between the Emperor Trajan and Pliny, who was a governor in part of what is now Turkey, which Pliny says, in fact, what on earth am I to do with these obstinate Christians who won't even put a pinch of incense on the altars of the gods. He's extremely reluctant to punish them for it. So a skeptical account of the rise of Christianity is very important in Gibbon, and one of the features of his history that's most remembered. I don't think after reading Gibbon and looking at his sources, you can any longer take seriously the official narrative of Christianity triumphing over its persecutors. And it's also apparent from Gibbon that Christians themselves were perfectly able to persecute. He describes, for example, the rise of the monks, who, to a large extent, rather than holy men, were a kind of shock troops who went about in armed bands and attacked pagan temples. And again, I find that perspective fully developed and substantiated in recent historians of the rise of Christianity, such as Robin Lane Fox and Katherine. So Gibbon's skepticism is certainly an important part of his legacy.
The next thing I want to talk about as well, and I'm trying to move on as quickly as I can,
Yep.
but I want to talk about as one important one. You mentioned Islam earlier and the Enlightenment, and so before the Enlightenment, the view on Islam was that it was a barbarous and we're not a pagan religion in a way, but then this would change. It's my understanding in the Enlightenment as they viewed Turkey, and especially and the second time on the border with Turkey, they would begin trade, and this kind of was not a border for war anymore, and it was being more laxed, especially in the Turkish and Habsburg borders. But I want to especially bring up the view on Islam and the Enlightenment, and of course, one of the most important figures of this time to visit Turkey and Istanbul was the wife of the ambassador to Montague, and she, of course, deserves an episode of herself. So because she is so fascinating. So let's talk about West and Islam, and of course Montague's journey to Istanbul.
Well, there's a great deal there, so I'll be brief. First, yes, it's very important for the view of Islam that until the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was a major threat. The Ottomans besieged Vienna in 1527 and 1683, and came very close to capturing it both times. So that didn't exactly make people feel warm or tolerant towards Islam. Second, the standard view in the early modern period was that Muhammad was an impostor, a fraud. And it was only when the Quran became available in reliable translations and more knowledge about Islam penetrated to the West that a more nuanced and understanding view of Muhammad as a great religious leader became possible. For example, the account of Muhammad in Gibbon is actually a very serious, nuanced, and understanding psychological analysis that doesn't belittle him at all. Then, as you see, contact with the Islamic world increased in the form of trade and, of course, embassies. And you mentioned Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who accompanied her husband, Sir Edward Montagu, to Constantinople at the beginning of the 18th century. We know about this from her Turkish letters, not letters written at the time, but letters written up and published some decades after the event, where she gives a very tolerant and understanding view of Turkish society. She was admitted to the women's quarters. She demystifies the harem, saying it's simply the part of the house where women are in charge. She goes to a Turkish bath with Turkish ladies who are very charming to her, and she remarks that the gossip and sly looks you get in female society in London are completely absent there. And she's also famous, rightly or wrongly, for helping to introduce the practice of inoculation, which is found in use among the Turks. The idea was that with a smallpox victim, you took a small piece of skin, inserted it into the body of a healthy person, who would then have a very mild attack of smallpox and be immune thereafter. It usually worked, not invariably. It caught on in the West. In fact, Louis XV of France, if I remember correctly, refused to let himself be inoculated against smallpox and died of it. And that gave powerful confirmation to the value of inoculation as a treatment.
I want to talk about, you mentioned the harem, and I want to talk about the West view of harem, and it was I'm still sure, if you haven't read anything about Ottoman or Islamic history, you may still have the view that the harem was for, sexual pleasure. That is what these Ottoman sultans or the caliphs of the time were sexual deviants in a way that, they just use women for pleasure. But of course, you mentioned Montague disputed this, and that's not really true at all. That the harem wasn't. The sultans weren't really these sexual deviants. Some of them were, of course, sexually, very sexually involved in the harem. But that was always really the case for most, I believe. But this was. So let's talk about the West view of perception of the Ottoman harem at the time.
Well, the harem was a focus for male sexual fantasies. The idea of a sultan having several hundred women at his disposal has an obvious attraction. But the harem in Constantinople, for example, was not like that. It was a place where young women were trained to become the wives of high-ranking Turkish officials in adult life. The Sultan had 4 wives. That was quite enough to satisfy the sexual desires of most men. Also, the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, now Istanbul, had both a male and a female harem. In the male harem, young men taken from Christian communities in the European parts of the Ottoman Empire and converted to Islam were trained to become janissaries, soldiers, and administrators. So both the male and female harems were a kind of elite boarding school, or even finishing school. We also tend to imagine that the harem was a place of luxury, where women were constantly indulging themselves, bathing, perfuming themselves, and so forth, and admiring their own bodies. And that's certainly the fantasy we can see in the well-known harem pictures by Ingres, for instance. But in fact, from reliable accounts, the harem was quite uncomfortable. A lot of the rooms were underground, below the waterline, and they're so cold that each winter a few girls would die of cold. So they it's better to imagine the harem as a rather pardon me, a rather rigorous boarding school, and put aside these Western fantasies.
Hmm. The next issue is a rather more serious one, and I want to talk about this as well because the Enlightenment kind of made more towards equality for men, but the
Yep.
next the thing is, of course, the issue of slavery, which was still
Yeah.
abundant at the time. And though it wouldn't be, it began to be abolished in the British Empire, slave trade, slavery in the British colonies would not fully be abolished, of course, until 1830. But I do believe that the historians of the time, of this era today, of course, dispute that life didn't really get better for the African slaves after the abolishment of the slave trade. So, though the discussion of equality amongst men, did that ever apply to the men of color and men and women who were former slaves or freed slaves? And did it ever cross their mind that maybe they are the same as us, that they are human as well, and that they should get the equality treatment? And of course, some of poverty as a result of slavery can still be seen in the United States today, especially in the southern part of the country. And racism was still part of the United States, quite sadly, and especially in the South. But were there ever concerns in the Enlightenment that there maybe they are humans like us?
Enlightenment thinkers were quite clear that blacks were as human as they were. And I think we have to distinguish between slavery and the slave trade. Slavery was illegal in Britain. This was established by a court case in the 1770s. Somebody brought his slave over from America. The slave sought his freedom, and the judges agreed that whatever was the case in America, you couldn't be a slave in Britain. Similarly, slavery was illegal in France, and it was abolished throughout the French dominions by the Revolution, but unfortunately restored by Napoleon. The slave trade is another matter because, of course, it was immensely profitable. And the credit for attacking it and eventually bringing it to an end belongs not so much to the Enlightenment as to religious figures inspired by a Christian sense of brotherhood, such as William Wilberforce. As for it is, of course, an embarrassment for the Enlightenment that some prominent Enlighteners owned slaves and went on doing so. The obvious example is Thomas Jefferson. I don't want to palliate Jefferson's slave owning, but slaves were property, and if you freed your slaves, you're giving up a large part of your personal property. And Jefferson, who was always in debt, couldn't afford to do so. I don't give that as an excuse, but as a reason. There's also a question: what would the slaves do when they were freed? And in fact, after slaves were freed in the American Civil War, they weren't allowed to enjoy the freedom very much because in the South, the Jim Crow legislation was rapidly introduced, which excluded them from participation. In 18th century London, there were quite a number of blacks. Estimates vary between 3 and 30,000, probably nearer 3 than 30. And so far as we can tell, they integrated fairly well. Samuel Johnson, for example, had a black servant called Frank Barber, who was not a slave, but a servant, who eventually married a white woman. We also have the case of the freed slave Ignacio Sancho, who got an education, became a well-known man of letters, published, and corresponded with Lord Stern and other writers.
And
in fact,
I'm not sure if sorry if I interrupted you, but I'm
go
not
on.
sure if you read Elizabeth Garcia's Black England, but she mentioned that there was a relationship between a black servant and I'm not sure if the same person you refer to, but it's I don't remember the name, but the black servant and I wouldn't say owner, but his master. It was quite close, and it was more than just being. It was more friendship in a way because I do believe he inherited some of the owner's inheritance as well. So some cases there were servants, black servants who were quite close, really close with their owners. Not owners, but the masters.
Masters, yeah. I think, in fact, that in these cases, black servants were treated in the same way as white servants, and no racial difference was made between them. I think she probably is referring to Frank Barber.
Yeah.
I must also say that the Enlightened is often accused of fostering the ideology of racism. It's too big a subject to go into readily, but I would say that, speaking in a very broad brush way, there was more tolerance towards blacks and non-whites in the 18th century than there was in the 19th. When imperialism by itself, holding down large tracts of Asia and Africa, made colonists think of the natives or the indigenes as natural enemies, and indeed their behavior often made them into enemies. That said, I mustn't fail to mention two statements that have brought the Enlightenment into a large amount of discredit, though I think are unjustly. One is from Hume. In his essay on national characters, he has a long footnote saying that he has reason to believe that blacks are less intelligent than whites, and there have never been any geniuses or great men among them. Some of Hume's contemporaries disagreed with this statement and challenged it in print, but Hume retained it without revision in successive editions of the essay. So that's a black mark from him, but I don't think, as some people do, that it puts his entire philosophy in doubt. Second, I must mention Kant, who says very disparaging things about blacks. But once again, I think that's a stain, but it doesn't affect his philosophy as a whole.
And it kind of brings us nicely into the next issue that we are going to talk about, which is we mentioned it earlier in British India, but as well, then think Enlightenment would bring a new view into the idea of colonialism and having colony abroad. So let's talk a little bit about how the Enlightenment should kind of change, kind of some, though of course it wouldn't be fully abolished until the late 1960s or maybe to 70s as it is. But let's talk about the view of colonialism, because there were some people that were more or less opposed to mention the treatment of the Indians and there is a book from the British in India that I'm going to read this, and it's soon now, but it's let's talk about the view on colon, because it was quite appalling, and if you want a great book on British decline and fall of the British Empire by Piers Brennan is absolutely worth going through, because there's a lot of issues. They really bring out the dark side of colonialism as well, and I want to talk a little bit about the view on colonialism under the Enlightenment.
Well, if the book you're going to read is The British in India by David Gilmour, it's a very good book, which I heartily recommend. But now I think to answer that question, we mustn't talk as if the Enlightenment meant the same as the 18th century. The commercial and overseas expansion of Britain, to stay with Britain for the moment, included giving a great deal of power to a private company, the East India Company, which had a monopoly of trade with India.
I kind of, in fact, sorry for interrupting you, but I kind of have a joke that, the East India Company is the only successful evil company to successfully take over the world, in a sense.
Well, in a sense, yes. They had a very large private army, and they were every bit as exploitative as the Indian rulers whom they displaced, in fact, more so. It's notorious that they did their best to end, for example, the Indian textile industry, so that Indians should import cloth from Britain. Their tax farmers imposed, I talked earlier about the evils of tax farming, but tax farmers imposed such burdens on the population of Bengal and the neighboring provinces that the result was an extremely serious famine in which millions perished. And this in one of the most well-endowed provinces of India. The East India Company was not even well run in the narrowest sense. It went bankrupt, and because it was thought to be too big to fail, the Bank of England had to strain all its resources to bail it out. Enlightened thinkers were very well aware of the oppression being carried out by the East India Company. Apart from anything else, men who had made their fortunes in India, who are known as nabobs, will come back to Britain and show off their wealth ostentatiously. In fact, the nabob is always a negative character in English fiction of the time. However, the East India Company continued until 1858, until 2 years after the Indian Mutiny, which showed that India really could no longer be run in this fashion. Increasingly, some company administrators thought that they should, quote, civilize the Indians as well as exploit them. Macaulay, for example, the historian, who works in India as a company administrator, was very keen that the Indian educated class should acquire a Western education. But he unfortunately thought that Indian literature was not good enough by comparison with Greek and Latin classics. And
which is, of course, ludicrous.
It is. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are certainly up there with Homer and Virgil. But anyway, Macaulay, out of an ingrained prejudice rather than knowledge, denied this and thought the Indians ought to study Homer. And so the opportunity to learn from Indian culture was largely missed. One good intellectual result of the company was that Sir William Jones, who was a judge in Calcutta, made a study of Indian languages, found that Sanskrit had many affinities with Latin and Greek, and founded the concept of Indo-European philology. But it was an intellectual gain bought at a very high price. And rather than putting all the blame on the British, it must be said that the Dutch, already in the 17th century, had their trading company in in the Dutch East Indies, what is now Indonesia. Indonesia was occupied by the Japanese during the Second World War. The Dutch tried very hard to restore their rule there, but were unsuccessful. So
You mentioned, if I may, sorry for interrupting you again, but I want to bring up another book. I don't know if you read this by Shashi Tharoor called Inglorious Empire, where he mentioned how India was, that before there was a toleration, and it was kind of what we today would call transsexuals, and they kind of did have this toleration for same sex, maybe not marriage, but same sex couples, and there was a form of toleration that existed in India before. But granted, they had the caste system and still have, but there were a form of toleration that existed in India before the British arrived, and how this change and still is affected today because of the colonialism, and it brings out a lot of the things in India that were, and it's a really great book if you want to read about how the British transformed India, not in a great way, as and how apologies seem to transfer for empire in India as well. But it's a really great book if you want to read more about how the British transformed India from under their rule.
Well, thank you for the recommendation. All I would say to that is that there was also an immense Christian missionary effort in India, without very much success, and that Christian missionaries couldn't accept that India had highly sophisticated and ancient religions, Hinduism, Islam, and Sikhism, among others, which meant that their missionary efforts didn't achieve and couldn't have achieved very much. But again, I think this missionary zeal is another example of the Western arrogance that we've heard so much about recently.
So I'll be going to end very soon because it's posted for quite a while. And the last thing I want to talk, one of the last things I want to talk about is, of course, some of the things that I have discussed. I'm going to discuss hopefully more in detail in the future. But the revolution as well the Enlightenment had an impact on the revolution. That's one of the last things that you write about in the book as well. So let's talk about the revolutions and the impact the Enlightenment had on the revolutions.
Okay, well, one important point to establish, which I make much of in the book, is that the French Revolution was a political event, and political events have political causes rather than intellectual causes. The roots of the French Revolution are to be sought not in the ideas of the philosophes, not in Rousseau, not in the scurrilous pamphlets denouncing Marie Antoinette, which Robert Darnton thinks were very important, but in the complete failure of successive finance ministers to manage the French economy. And that has a lot to do with the inordinate privileges I mentioned earlier given to nobles and the church, exempting them from taxes. It has a lot to do as well with crop failures, bad harvests, and rural poverty, which led to a succession of rural uprisings in the 1780s. And in fact, it didn't take very much for the attack on the Bastille to spark off popular riots that brought the National Assembly to the fore. I would say also that the Enlightened thinkers that come readily to mind, the philosophes, Voltaire and Diderot, etc. Those associated with the Encyclopédie did not really have much impact on the revolution. In fact, Robespierre always denounces them for their disbelief in God. Robespierre was a deist, a firm believer in God, although a God that didn't.
That's kind of ironic, considering that tried the Christianization under the new regime. I find that kind of ironic that he was a Christian.
Well, whether deism is compatible with Christianity is a question. I don't think it is, because if you're deist, you don't believe in the divinity of Christ. And this de-Christianization was, above all, an attack on the power and wealth of the church in France. And in a very broad sense, it was the fulfillment of Enlightenment polemics against the church. They're going further than the Enlightenment ever envisaged. If you want an intellectual source for the French Revolution, then you have to look to Rousseau and to his ideal of a simple society in which honest poverty encourages virtue, and virtue was the watchword of the French Revolution. But unfortunately, virtue was the excuse for the imprisonment in the course of the 1790s of one French adult in 10 for civil war and for for, in the end, the extreme impoverishment of France. Not only that, but the revolutionaries, when things are going badly, sought to distract the population by means of foreign wars, in which they were remarkably successful. The revolutionary troops defeated the armies of Prussia and Austria at Valmy in September 1792. But war was not only defensive, but a means of distracting the population from their hardships. And of course, the pattern discerned by Enlightenment historians, in which a state breaks down into civil war and is then replaced by a strong man, came to pass in France as well. The strong man being Napoleon, who has sometimes been called a belated enlightened despot, but that's really another story.
The last thing I want to ask as a whole, and this may be obvious for anyone who listened, also maybe obvious for anyone who paid attention to this episode, but what would you say is the legacy of the Enlightenment?
The legacy of the Enlightenment is all around us. In my chapter in Practical Enlightenment, I talk about how administrators, especially in France and above all in the German states, introduced a great many reforms for which the state was responsible. Nowadays, the lives we live are very highly organized, and to an extent that was unthinkable 400 years ago, and that is a legacy of the Enlightenment. Then, of course, one is bound to say, look here, what about Putin and various other political figures who I'd rather not name. Well, at least we see them for what they are. And that there's a thought in Kant that I find rather cheering. Kant says that when the French Revolution broke out, every well-intentioned intellectual person welcomed the overthrow of the Ancien regime. Now, of course, the revolution went horribly wrong. But at all events, the wrongdoing of the Ancien regime was exposed, and there was no way of restoring it to credit. So the revolution at least changed people's consciousness. Or to take an analogy, slavery gradually came to an end, although it still exists in some forms, but at least we know that slavery is wrong. Nobody now thinks slavery is right. And we could cite a number of parallel cases where the Enlightenment changed consciousness.
I think you've done a round it up there, and thank you so much for coming on to do this two-parter. It's been a great pleasure to have you on to speak about the Enlightenment. And before you go, do you have anything you want to promote or anything where people might find you if they have further questions about the Enlightenment? Of course, where can people buy your book, The Enlightenment, The Pursuit of Happiness? If they want to read more about the topic, I highly recommend read this book. It's quite big, but it's well worth the time because we only discussed a tip of the iceberg of what is discussed in the book. So, of course, yeah. Do you have anything you want to promote before you go?
Well, thank you very much. I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast again. This has been Well That Aged Well. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Apple Podcasts, please write a review. If you're on YouTube, comment if you like this episode, what you think about Enlightenment. And of course, subscribe if you are on Spotify. Consider writing 5 stars. That would be great and help us out quite a lot. My name's Alan. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.